Tonight, all 5 stories take place on trains. Passenger trains. Freight-adjacent lines. Overnight sleeper cars moving through states you have never heard of at 3 a.m. Different people. Different routes. Different things they found when they looked down the aisle or opened the door to the wrong compartment. Some of these are true scary stories sent in by viewers. Some I found on my own. All of them stayed with me. Every one of them involves a train. These are real scary stories. And after tonight, I think they will stay with you too. The first one happened to a woman named Cassie. She was 26 at the time, working as a paralegal in Chicago. She had taken trains her whole life. She had never once had any reason to be afraid of them. I want to tell you the part one cannot stop thinking about first, because it is the part that everything else leads to, and I need you to have it before I explain anything around it. I was standing in the narrow corridor between cars, the kind with the rubber accordion walls that flex and breathe every time the train shifts around a curve, and I was looking at the closed door to car 7. I had my hand on the handle. I knew what was on the other side of that door because I had spent the entire trip in there. But the sound coming through the door was not the sound of an empty car rocking on its rails. It was breathing. Low and rhythmic. The kind of breathing you hear from someone who has been in one place for a long time and has gone very still. And underneath the breathing there was something else. A voice, very quiet, barely above a whisper, counting numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A pause. Then again from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Over and over from somewhere near the back of the car. And I had been the only passenger in car 7 for the last 90 miles. I need to back up from that moment and tell you how I got there. I took the overnight train from Chicago to Pittsburgh because I had a major deposition to prepare for, and I believed the quiet of a moving train late at night would help me focus in a way that my apartment could not. This was late October, a Tuesday night. The kind of night where the station platforms are mostly empty, and the conductors have that specific tired look that comes from years of the same shift rather than from one particularly hard day. I boarded at Union Station just after 9 in the evening. I had a reserved seat in car 7, which turned out to be one of the older cars they keep on the less popular routes, with seats that were a little more worn in than the newer fleet, overhead lights that buzzed at a frequency just barely loud enough to notice if you were paying attention, and a smell that was not quite musty but was not quite not musty either. I settled in with my laptop and a large coffee from the station concession and watched Chicago slide away through the window. Car 7 had maybe 4 other passengers when we pulled out. A couple near the front who fell asleep before we even cleared the city limits, her head resting on his shoulder, his head tipped back against the headrest with his mouth slightly open. An older man with a folded newspaper who read through the paper methodically and then got off at the first stop in Indiana, tucking the paper neatly into the seat pocket in front of him before he rose and gathered his coat, like he was leaving things in order. A teenage kid with over-ear headphones who I stopped registering as present sometime after midnight. By the time we were a full hour outside Chicago and the last suburb lights had faded into flat, dark countryside, it was just me and the hum of the rails and the dark flat land of Indiana going past outside the window. I know how this sounds. Alone in a train car at night. I want to be clear that this felt completely ordinary to me. I grew up taking regional trains to visit my grandmother in Ohio. I have taken overnight trains for work before. The alone part was the entire point of choosing the train over flying. I needed to work without anyone being able to reach me. I worked for about 2 hours on the deposition prep and made real progress, the kind that feels different from daytime work, more concentrated, with fewer interruptions from my own phone and brain. The train helped. There is something about the constancy of the motion and the sound that pushed everything else out and let me focus in a way I rarely can at a desk. By midnight, I had gone through 2/3 of the transcript and made notes in the margins of everything I needed to follow up on. I felt good about the trip. I thought my wife had been right to suggest the train. I worked for about 2 hours on the deposition prep. Then I fell asleep with my laptop still open on the tray table in front of me. I woke up to the train slowing through some small Ohio station I had never heard of, A name on a schedule that corresponds to a town that exists only because a train stops there. No one got on. The platform was dark except for one yellow light on a pole that gave the whole empty platform the look of an old photograph. We started moving again, and I looked out the window as we pulled away from that small dark station. There is something specifically melancholy about an empty platform disappearing behind a train. The single yellow light. The bench with nobody on it. The name of the town on the sign going by too fast to read completely. I have always liked that quality of train travel, that you pass through the peripheral edges of places, through the functional parts that are not meant for sightseeing, and you see them from the outside like someone who is moving through rather than stopping. We started moving again, and I drank the cold remains of my coffee and went back to my notes. It was around 1 a.m. when I got up to use the bathroom at the far end of car 7. I walked down the aisle with one hand trailing along the tops of the seatbacks because the car was doing that mild rolling sway that night trains do on certain sections of track. As I passed the back of the car, I noticed something that I filed away and immediately explained to myself. The overhead light above the very last row of seats was flickering. Not buzzing the way the other overhead lights were buzzing in a constant way you can tune out. Flickering. A rhythmic pulse. Like a light that someone is switching rapidly on and off from the other side of the fixture. I looked at the seat under the flickering light as I walked past. Empty. A dark blue blanket folded over the headrest. I did not remember anyone sitting there when I boarded, but I had not been paying attention when I boarded. I was tired and looking for my seat number. I used the bathroom and came back and sat down and did not think about the flickering light again for another hour. Sometime after 2 a.m. I got up to stretch. My back had tightened from the laptop position and my neck was stiff on one side. The train was in full dark now. No platform lights, no towns, no roads visible through the windows. Just black countryside moving at speed outside the glass. I walked to the front of the car and stood there for a minute rolling my neck and stretching my arms overhead. The car smelled like recycled air and old upholstery and the faint chemical residue of whatever cleaning product they use on the floors. Very normal. Very quiet. Then I turned around to walk back to my seat in the middle of the car. The light at the back of car 7 was no longer flickering. It was off. Completely off. Which meant that section of the car, the last 4 rows, was not dim but dark. The buzzing overhead light illuminated the middle section and then stopped at a hard line, and past that line there was nothing to see. I stood at the front of the car and looked down the long aisle toward the dark end and let my eyes adjust. The seat in the last row on the right side was no longer empty. Someone was sitting in it. Facing forward. Sitting in a stillness that was not the stillness of sleep. Not the small involuntary movements of a person who is out, the occasional head drop, the small adjustments of a body at rest. This was the stillness of a person who is awake and not moving. Completely still. The way a person sits when they are aware of being watched and have decided not to react. I stood there for a long moment and I thought through every rational explanation I could construct. Passenger who boarded at the last Ohio stop and walked past while I was asleep. The folded blanket I had seen on the headrest earlier bunched into a shape that resembled a person in the reduced light. An effect of the darkness and the distance. I thought through all of these things and I found each of them possible. Then I walked back to my seat and sat down and opened my laptop and I did not turn around. I did not turn around for 20 minutes. I know this because I have a time-stamped edit in the deposition document at 2:18 a.m. and another at 2:38 a.m. 20 minutes of keeping my eyes on the screen and telling myself there was a normal explanation and that I was not the kind of person who panics in empty train cars at 2 a.m. When I finally turned around, the seat was empty. I want to be precise about this. I did not see anyone stand up. The aisle was narrow and straight and directly to my left and in my peripheral vision the entire time. If someone had stood and walked toward the bathroom at the rear of the car or toward the front door, I would have detected the movement. I always notice movement in my peripheral field. It is just the way I am built. Nobody walked past me. Nobody walked anywhere. The seat was occupied and then it was empty, and I have no version of events that connects those two states. I closed my laptop. I sat very still and I went over everything again. Flickering light that then went dark. Shape in the last seat that then disappeared. I thought about getting up and going to the next car. I thought about calling out to the empty car, which felt stupid. I thought about texting someone, but I could not figure out what the text would say. I already felt like I was being ridiculous. Nothing I could name clearly had happened. I decided to walk to the back of the car and look at that seat directly. This is the part one would tell you to skip if I thought you would listen to me. I walked to the last row of car 7 with my phone flashlight on, holding it down at my side. I looked at the seat on the right. Empty. Just the seat cushion and the headrest and the dark blue blanket now on the seat rather than the headrest. I looked at the seat on the left. Empty. I lowered the flashlight to the floor of the car in that last row, and I looked at what was there. On the floor, in the space between the two seats, there was a small paper bag, the kind from a deli, folded over at the top. And next to the paper bag, arranged in a very careful parallel row on the dark carpet, were 6 fingernail clippings. Long ones. Lined up next to each other with exact spacing. Like someone had taken great care with the arrangement. Like the arrangement itself was the point. They were fresh. Not yellowed or dried. The edges still had the pale color and slight curve of something cut from a living person recently. Someone had been sitting in that dark back seat clipping their nails and arranging the clippings on the floor while the car rocked on the rails and I worked 20 feet away. I walked back to the corridor between cars. The accordion walls moved with the train. I stood there with my hand on the door to car 7. And through the door I heard it. The breathing first. Then the counting, low and steady. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Patient. Completely patient. I did not open that door. I stood there for what felt like a long time. The counting continued. Very quiet. Very patient. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not rushing. Not changing rhythm. Just going. Like something that had all night and knew it. I thought about the nail clippings arranged on the floor. 6 of them, parallel. I thought about how long that takes. To sit in a dark seat and clip each nail and then arrange them, one at a time, in a neat row on the carpet. It is not a fast process. It takes patience. It takes a particular kind of stillness. You sit in one spot and you do a small deliberate thing and you do it carefully. And then you do the next one. And then you line them up. I thought about how long they had been in car 7 before I noticed them. I thought about whether they had been there when I boarded in Chicago or whether they had settled in somewhere along the line while I was working or while I was asleep. I thought about what it means to sit that quietly in the dark that close to another person for that long and do something that careful with your hands. I walked to car 6 and found a seat facing the connecting door and I did not sleep for the rest of the trip. Nobody came through that door. When we pulled into Pittsburgh at 4:50 a.m. I was the first person off the train. I stood on the cold dark platform and I watched the doors of every car. 3 people came off car 7. An older woman with a rolling suitcase. A man in a work jacket with a lunchbox. A young guy checking his phone. None of them looked like a person who had been sitting in the dark for 3 hours arranging fingernail clippings on a floor. I reported it to the Amtrak staff on the platform. I described the seat, the paper bag, the clippings, the sound. The man wrote down my name and number. Nobody ever called. 2 weeks later I went through the front pocket of my laptop bag, which I had not opened at any point on the trip. Inside it was a small piece of paper, the kind torn from a spiral notebook. Written on it, in small careful handwriting, was a column of numbers 1 through 5. Next to each number, my first name. Just my first name, written 5 times. 1 through 5. My name beside each number. I did not put that paper there. Nobody touched my bag on that train except me. And whoever wrote that had been close enough to my bag to open the pocket and leave something inside. Which means they had been in car 7. sitting near me while I worked, near me while I slept, knowing who I was the whole time, counting to 5 over and over in the dark and knowing my name. I still have the paper. I am not going to throw it away. I think that would be a kind of dishonesty I cannot manage. The next story comes from a man named Derek who took a sleeper car from Seattle through rural Montana for his 41st birthday and discovered that the compartment directly across from his, listed by the attendant as empty, had been occupied the whole night. My name is Derek. I am 41. I work in logistics and travel almost exclusively by plane. The train from Seattle through Montana was my wife's birthday gift to me. She booked me a private sleeper compartment, told me to relax, said I needed to see the country instead of just flying over it. I thought she was right. I thought it sounded peaceful. I was wrong about the peaceful part, though not for any reason I could have anticipated. I want to start with what I found when I returned to my compartment after dinner. I had been gone 45 minutes. Dining car, a decent meal, 1 beer, a brief conversation with a retired schoolteacher from Oregon who was visiting her daughter in the Glacier area. Normal. I came back down the narrow sleeper corridor and used my keycard to open my compartment door. I had the only keycard. The attendant, a young man named Marcus, had a MasterCard, but I had watched him carrying food and clearing plates in the dining car the entire time I was there. My pillow was on the floor, pushed off the edge of the fold-down bed, and on the small table next to the window, where I had left my paperback face down, there was a ceramic coffee cup, full. When I pressed my palm against the outside of it, it was warm. Not cool. Not cold. Warm, the way a cup is warm when the coffee has been in it for 20 minutes rather than 3 hours. I had not made any coffee. There was no coffee maker in the compartment. The only coffee on the train was available from the lounge car 2 cars forward. I stood in the doorway and looked at the cup for a full minute before I stepped inside. The trip had begun normally. I boarded in Seattle Thursday evening. The compartment was small, metal-walled, smelled of recycled air and old upholstery and years of cleaning product applied to the same surfaces again and again until the smell became part of the surfaces themselves. The fold-down bed was narrow but functional. The window was tall. I watched the Seattle skyline fade and the Cascades come up in the evening light, and I felt genuinely at ease in a way I had not felt in months of travel. Like my wife had given me exactly the right thing. The sleeper car was not full. I could tell by the quality of the silence in the corridor when I walked to dinner. That specific emptiness that a space has when it contains fewer people than it was designed for. I passed the other compartment doors, all closed. No sounds from any of them. At dinner I asked Marcus how many of the 8 compartments were occupied. He checked his sheet. 4, he said. He named the numbers. Mine was among them. Compartment 11, the one directly across the hall from mine, was listed as empty. I noted that. Filed it away without knowing why. Compartment 11. Empty. I came back from dinner. Pillow on the floor. Warm coffee on the table. I called Marcus on the room phone. He came in 3 minutes, looked at the cup without touching it, said he had not made coffee for my room and had not been inside since he showed me to it when I boarded. He left. He came back 12 minutes later. He said he had no explanation. He noted it in his log. He told me to call him if anything else happened. I latched the door from inside and sat on the bed with my back against the wall, and I read and I listened. The train made its sounds. Long creaking exhales in the walls. The steady double beat of wheels on rail joints. The hiss of the suspension around curves. I learned all of it. I catalogued it until I knew which sounds were the train and which sounds would be something else. At midnight, I heard something from across the hall. From compartment 11. The sounds of a train are loud enough that a person across a corridor would normally be inaudible. This was just barely audible. The creak of a cushion taking weight. The specific sound a seat makes when a person sits down in it. One creak. Silence. I told myself the train was making structural sounds. Old trains make sounds in their joints and their seams. Compartment 11 was on Marcus's list as empty. At 12:40, I heard a different sound. The small deliberate sound of an object being placed on a hard surface. Like a mug being set down carefully. Not dropped or put down carelessly. Set down with intention. The way you set something down quietly when you are aware of the silence around you and are choosing to move within it rather than disturb it. I lay there in the narrow bed and thought about the warm coffee. Someone had been in my locked compartment while I was at dinner. They knew how long I would be gone. They knew which room was mine. They had my ticket information. They had put something in my room and gone back across the hall and closed themselves into a compartment that was supposed to be empty. I did not sleep that night. I listened to compartment 11 until the sounds stopped around 2 a.m. and the train went quiet and dark outside Montana. After the sounds stopped, I lay in the narrow bed with the light on, and I thought through everything very carefully. Someone had gotten into my compartment. They had the means to do it, a master key or some knowledge of the lock system I did not have. They had left something there. A cup of coffee. Warm. This means they had access to the lounge car as well, or to a coffee source I was not aware of. They had then returned to compartment 11 and been there for hours. The cushion indentation. The dried ring. The folded ticket. The folded ticket was the thing I kept coming back to. That was not an opportunistic crime. That was not someone who found a way onto a train and picked a random compartment to occupy. Someone had my specific ticket information before the trip. They had printed it. They had brought it. They had sat with it for hours in the dark in a compartment that was listed as empty. They had planned this before I boarded. Maybe before my wife booked the trip. I am in logistics. I spend a large amount of my working life thinking about how information moves and where it can be intercepted. After that night, I started thinking about every point in the ticket purchase process where a name and an itinerary could be seen by someone who should not be seeing it. There are more of them than most people realize. Every system that touches a booking contains the information. Travel agencies. Credit card processors. The rail company's own internal systems. Maintenance schedules that include passenger manifests. Catering requests tied to compartment numbers. Someone somewhere in that chain had found my name. Had seen my compartment number. Had decided to come. At the morning stop in Whitefish, I got off the train and stood on the platform and watched every person who came out of the sleeper car and every person who reboarded. Nobody I could not account for. When we started moving, I walked back to compartment 11. The door was resting against the frame, not latched. I pushed it open. Empty. But the center of the seat cushion had an indentation in it. Deep and settled, the kind of impression that forms over many hours in a single spot. Not the impression of someone who sat briefly. The shape of someone who had been sitting there for a long time. There was a dried liquid ring on the window ledge, the ring left by a cup that sat in one place for hours. And folded on the seat cushion was a piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a printout of my Amtrak ticket. My full name. My departure city. My arrival city. My compartment number. Printed on regular white paper and folded the way you fold something you plan to look at and refer back to. Someone had printed my ticket and brought it onto the train and sat with it in the compartment across from mine for the entire night. Marcus called ahead. 2 transit officers boarded at the next stop. They searched every car. Found nobody without a valid ticket. Nobody unaccounted for. They took my statement and the paper and got off at the following station. No contact from Amtrak after that. A form letter came weeks later. No findings. But I think about the indentation in that cushion. Not the front edge. Not the impression of someone sitting briefly and leaving. Centered and deep. The shape of someone settled in. Someone comfortable in that seat. Someone for whom that compartment was familiar, not new. Someone who had done this before. Maybe many times. On many trains. Who knew which compartments would be occupied and which ones were listed as empty. who knew how to move through a sleeper car in the dark without being heard, who sat for an entire night holding a piece of paper with my name on it and tracking the sounds from across the hall. I do not know how they got my name. I do not know how they got into my locked compartment. I do not know how they left that train without being found on it. I just know that they were 12 inches from my door for an entire night and that the dented cushion and the dried cupping told me they had been comfortable, settled, patient in a way that suggested practice. The next story comes from a woman named Lena who worked third shift cleaning regional rail cars in Pennsylvania for 6 years and found something in car 4 one night at 2 a.m. that the transit authority later quietly removed from service and returned without explanation. I was 34. 6 years on the night cleaning crew for a regional rail line. The schedule was 11 at night to 6 in the morning. You moved through empty cars with your cart and your supplies and sometimes a podcast in one ear. The repetition becomes the job. The cars stop being individual places after a while. They become a checklist. A seat is a seat. A floor is a floor. You stop looking at them as places where things happen and start seeing them as surfaces that need to be made clean. The night this happened, I had 5 cars assigned to me on a side track. A long-haul train that had come in for overnight servicing. Cars 1 through 5. Standard. I started with car 1, worked through it in about 40 minutes, moved to 2, then 3, reached car 4 around 2 a.m. The sidetrack was in one of those industrial stretches of a mid-sized Pennsylvania city. Quiet in a way that industrial areas are quiet at night. No traffic, no voices, just the distant hum of the city on the other side of a sound barrier wall, and the particular silence of empty rail cars on a dark track. I will tell you what I found in the second to last row of car 4 before I tell you anything else, because it is what the whole thing is about. Tucked into the gap between the seat cushion and the outer wall of the car was a white women's sneaker. Size 7, from the look of it. Laces still tied. Not just loosely tied, double-knotted and neat, the way someone ties shoes when they intend to wear them. A shoe that has been placed there rather than accidentally left. Inside the shoe, folded into a very small square, was a wallet-sized photograph. School picture format, the kind with the blue gradient background that school photo companies have been using for decades. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 19 or 20 years old, smiling at the camera in that direct, slightly stiff way people smile when a photographer is instructing them to. Her hair was pulled back. She had small earrings. She looked like anyone you know. On the back of the photograph, in blue ballpoint ink that had bled slightly at the edges as if the photo had been wet at some point and then dried, was a name I am not going to say here. And a date. The date was 3 weeks before the night I found it. And on the floor of car 4, next to the shoe, running parallel to the seat base in the hard plastic floor paneling, were 4 deep scratch marks. Not surface scratches. Gouged in. The kind of marks that require sustained downward pressure over time. The kind of marks that a person's fingernails leave when they are gripping something and not letting go. The marks ran about 8 inches and ended at the edge of the aisle. I stood in car 4 at 2 a.m. on a side track in Pennsylvania, and I stood very still, and I thought about the set of events that produces a tied and knotted shoe, a school photograph of a young woman dated 3 weeks prior, and 4 deep parallel scratches in a train floor that end at an aisle edge. I stood there and I thought about that for a while. And then I called my supervisor. He came down in about 15 minutes. He looked at everything carefully without touching anything. Then he made a call and 2 transit police officers arrived. They photographed the shoe and the photograph and the scratches from multiple angles. They asked me careful repeated questions about whether I had touched or moved anything before calling. I told them I had picked up the photograph to see the back of it. They noted this. One officer stepped off the car and made a call on his radio. When he came back, his whole manner was different. He said I should finish the remaining cars on my list, cars 1 through 3 and car 5, and that I should not come back to car 4. He said it in the way that means the conversation is over and no further questions are invited. I finished my other 4 cars that night. Car 4 sat on the sidetrack with its interior lights on and 2 officers nearby. When my shift ended at 6 a.m. it was still there. I never received any official information about what happened or what the analysis found. But a transit mechanic I had worked alongside for years told me 2 weeks later, quietly and without a lot of detail, that Car 4 had been processed by a forensic team. That it had been pulled from service for a period of weeks. That it had eventually been returned to rotation. He said that when he asked about the scratches he was told he did not need to know. He believed it. I believed him. I have not been assigned to Car 4 in the 3 years since. I have noticed this. I do not think it is coincidental. I think someone on the scheduling side knows what I found in that car, and is doing me the only kindness that is available to them within the system, which is to make sure I am not the one who has to go back into it alone at 2 a.m. I think about the date on the back of that photograph sometimes. 3 weeks before I found it. I think about what that date might have meant, what it might mark, whether anyone is looking for the young woman in the photo. I hope she is somewhere safe. I have been unable to convince myself that she is. The next story was sent in by a man named Paul who is 53, works in property management in eastern Tennessee, and who took a weekend tourist excursion train through the Smoky Mountains with his 9-year-old daughter on a fall Saturday that he has thought about almost every day since. My daughter had been asking to ride a train since she saw one in a movie when she was 7 years old. The mountain excursion was perfect for her. A 2-hour round-trip scenic ride up into the hills and back through the fall foliage, an open car with a narration guide over the speakers. We boarded on a Saturday morning in the middle of October when the air was sharp and cold and the leaves were doing everything they are supposed to do up in those hills. My daughter had her little camera out before we even got to the platform. She had been talking about the train for 3 days. I want to tell you about the man in the row ahead of us before I explain anything else. We found our seats 6 rows from the front of the open car. The man was already seated 2 rows ahead of us. He was alone. He had boarded before we arrived. His seat was one of the kind that can be flipped to face either direction on the car, and he had positioned his to face backward. Toward the back of the car. Toward us. Every other passenger on the car was facing forward, into the mountains, toward the scenery they had come to see. He was facing us. And when we sat down and I looked at him directly, he did not look away. He held my gaze for a moment, and then his eyes moved to my daughter, and then back to me, and then back to my daughter, and the expression on his face had no name I could put on it. Not hostile. Not friendly. Just noting. Like an inventory. I told myself that some people genuinely prefer facing backward on a moving train. It is a real preference, something about not seeing where you are going, less motion sickness. I looked out at the mountains and pointed things out to my daughter, and I let 10 minutes go by. But in those 10 minutes, the man did not take a single photograph. Did not look out at the foliage. Did not shift in his seat or stretch or do any of the small ordinary things a person does when they are on a 2-hour scenic excursion through beautiful country on a perfect fall day. He sat with his hands in his lap and his gaze moved between me and my daughter, and it did not stop. Not actively. Not staring in an aggressive way. Just present. Watching. Like taking a long quiet note. About 40 minutes into the ride my daughter decided she wanted a snack from the cart at the far end of the car. We stood up together and I let her lead the way because she was excited. As I stood I looked at the man. He had shifted his gaze from my daughter to my empty seat. Not to me standing. Not to my daughter walking ahead. To my empty seat. The space where I had been sitting for the past 40 minutes. He was looking at it like he was recording its vacancy. At the snack cart, I spoke quietly to the car attendant. I described the man 2 rows ahead. The backward-facing seat. The watching. She looked carefully down the car. She said she would keep an eye on things and that I should find her immediately if I needed her. When my daughter and I came back to our row, the man's seat was empty. He was not anywhere on the car that I could see. I looked the full length from front to rear. Not there. The train had not stopped. The excursion ran 2 open cars behind the locomotive and there was no interior connecting passage. Nowhere to go that was not one of those 2 cars. My daughter sat down and picked up her camera and started looking at what she had taken so far. She had not noticed anything. On the floor next to my foot, in the space between my row and the one ahead, was a small folded piece of notepaper that had not been there before we stood up. I picked it up and unfolded it. 2 words in handwriting I did not recognize. Beautiful daughter. 2 words. And they were not about the mountains or the leaves. I found the attendant. She radioed the station. 2 officers were on the platform when we pulled back in 40 minutes later. They walked through both cars. They did not find the man. The station security camera had footage of him boarding. Footage of him sitting in that backward-facing seat for the duration of the outbound trip. And then footage, from the rear camera, of him at the step at the back of the second car while the train was still in motion on the return. He stepped off. Not jumped. Stepped, deliberately and carefully, onto the gravel of the track bed, and he walked into the tree line alongside the rail. The camera tracked him for 8 seconds before the angle changed and the trees took him. He had planned that exit before the train left the station. He had known which car, which position, when to leave, where to step off. He had planned it all in advance, which meant he had planned everything before he boarded, which meant the 40 minutes of backward-facing watching had been planned too. The officers found nothing. No ID from the footage. No match in any system they had access to. They took our statements and the note and we drove home. I think about those 40 minutes. The backward seat. The gaze that came back to my daughter, and then to me, and then to my daughter again. The way it shifted to my empty seat when I stood up. 2 words on a piece of paper. And the question I have never been able to answer cleanly. What had he planned to do, and what was the part he had not started yet when I got up to get snacks and happened to mention him to the attendant? I try not to hold that question for too long at one time. But I hold it a little. Because I think I should. My daughter is 12 now. She still has her camera. She still loves trains in the abstract, in movies and books and photographs. She has not been back on one since that day because I have not taken her and she has not pushed for it. I do not know if she noticed something that day that she has not said to me. I do not know if she registered the man in the backward-facing seat, the way his eyes went to her. I have not asked. She seemed fine on the drive home. She showed me the photos she took and we talked about the leaves and the mountains. She ate a large meal when we got back and fell asleep in front of the television, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time going over everything. I gave a detailed statement to the officers that day. I described the man as precisely as I could. Height, build, the gray hoodie, the still quality of him, the way he sat with his hands in his lap. I described the backward-facing seat and the duration and the pattern of his gaze. They took the note in an evidence bag. The note that said beautiful daughter in handwriting I did not recognize. The thing about those 2 words is that they are not a threat. They do not say anything that would hold up as a threat in any legal context. A man wrote 2 words on a piece of paper. 2 words that are complementary, even in their surface meaning. Beautiful daughter. And he left them on the floor of a train car where only I would find them. And then he stepped off the moving train into the tree line and disappeared. Whatever was happening in his mind, I will never know what it was. That is what I come back to. I will never know what he planned. I will never know what the 2 hours of that ride looked like in his thinking. I will never know what the note was the beginning of, or whether it was the whole thing, or whether there was more that never happened because I said something to the attendant. I do not know which of those possibilities is better. The final story tonight comes from a 19-year-old college freshman named Thomas who took a night train from New Orleans to Houston at the end of his first semester, the first time he had ever traveled alone, and who saw something at a railroad crossing in the middle of southeast Texas at 3:12 in the morning that he has never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. I had just finished my first semester of college. I was going home to Houston for winter break. The bus was sold out and I could not come close to affording a last-minute flight, so I bought a coach ticket on the overnight train. 5 hours, a regular seat, a backpack on my lap, headphones in. I was planning to sleep the whole way. I boarded in New Orleans on a Thursday night feeling good about the semester and tired in that specific way of someone who has just finished their first round of college finals. I want to start at the Beaumont crossing. 3:12 a.m. Because that is where the center of everything is. The train stopped at what felt like the middle of nowhere. No platform. No station building. No other lights visible except the train's own and one distant streetlight on a service road about a quarter-mile away. Flat dark Texas land going out in every direction with nothing on it. The train stopping woke me up and I looked at my phone to see the time before I looked at anything else. 3:12 a.m. Then I looked out the window. Standing in the gravel alongside the track, about 20 feet from the train, was a man. Gray hoodie. Hood down. He was completely still. And he was looking directly at my window. Not at the train in general, not scanning the cars. My specific window. When I moved my head slightly to the right to see him better, his eyes moved with me. I know the difference between someone looking in the general direction of a train and someone tracking a specific face behind a specific pane of glass. He was tracking me. He was holding something against his chest. Both arms wrapped around it. Something flat and dark and rectangular, like a large binder or a thick folder. He was holding it the way you hold something that matters, something you are keeping close. As I watched, he took one slow deliberate step toward the train. Then he stopped. Then he raised his right arm and extended one finger and pointed directly at my window. One finger, steady and aimed, pointed at the glass I was sitting behind. The train began to move. I pressed my face close to the glass and I watched him until the angle changed and he was gone from my view. He did not lower his arm. He did not look away. He just stood in the dark Texas gravel pointing at a window on a passing train like that was exactly what he had come there to do. Let me back up to 2 hours before the crossing. The train had been completely normal for the first 3 hours out of New Orleans. Half-full coach car. Most people sleeping. The lights dimmed down for night. The South going by outside, bayou and pine and the occasional highway overpass, the flat wet landscape of Louisiana at night. I had a window seat with an empty seat next to me. I got maybe 90 minutes of uncomfortable sleep with my head against the glass and woke up around 2 a.m. feeling unrest. I sat looking out the window at the Louisiana dark. Just the country doing what the country does at 2 a.m. Nothing unusual. Then, sometime around 2:15 or so, I looked across the aisle at the seat directly opposite mine. It was an empty seat. Had been empty since I boarded in New Orleans. And on the center of the cushion there was something that had not been there the last time I looked at that seat, which was maybe 15 or 20 minutes prior. A rectangle of gray fabric. Folded flat and neat, placed in the center of the empty cushion. I looked at it for a moment. I looked up and down the aisle in both directions. The car was quiet and dim and nobody was nearby and nobody was moving. I reached across the aisle and touched the fabric. Rough cotton weave. Thick. The material that hooded sweatshirts are made from. I pulled my hand back. I sat there and I thought about how a folded piece of gray hoodie fabric ended up placed neatly on an empty seat in a dim train car at 2 a.m. I thought about who would have put it there and when. I had been looking at that seat on and off for the whole trip. I had not seen it before. But I had also been asleep. I could not be completely certain when it appeared. I talked myself down. I told myself I had just not noticed it. I put my headphones back in. But the folds. They were clean and deliberate. Not the soft crumpled mess of fabric that had been stuffed somewhere and forgotten. These were intentional folds, the kind that take a moment to make, the kind you make when you are placing something somewhere with care. I kept coming back to the folds. Then the crossing. Then the man in the gray hoodie pointing at my window. When the crossing was behind us and the train was moving again, I turned from the window and looked at the aisle seat. The gray fabric was gone. I had not moved from my seat. I had not crossed the aisle. The car behind me was visible in my window's reflection, and I had been staring out the glass the whole time we were stopped. I had not seen anyone come near that seat. I had not heard anyone. The fabric was there, and then it was not there, and I do not have a mechanism that connects those two facts. I sat with my hands in my lap for the rest of the trip, and I did not put my headphones back in, and I did not sleep, and I watched the aisle the way you watch something when you have decided you are not going to look away from it again. I got off in Houston at 4:15 a.m. and called my mom even though I knew she would be asleep. She answered on the fourth ring. I said I just got in, everything is fine. She said, okay baby, and went back to sleep. I stood under the station lights for 10 more minutes before I went to get my bag. I have never told the full version of this to anyone. Not my mom, not my roommate, not my college friends. This is the first time I have laid it out in order. The fabric, the folds, the man at the crossing, the way he tracked my window, the way he held the point, the way the fabric disappeared, the thing he was holding against his chest. Here is the part that stays with me. The crossing in question is not on any road I could find on a map. To reach that spot on the track bed, you would have to go on foot across open land, or use a utility access route. You would have to know which crossing. You would have to know which train. You would have to know which time. And you would have to know which window to point at on a moving train full of sleeping strangers. Someone knew all of those things. And they were standing in the dark in Texas with something held against their chest when the train slowed and my window went by. I take flights home now. I have since that winter break. I tell people it is more convenient. That is not why. I have tried to find that crossing on a map. I have looked at satellite images of the rail line between Beaumont and Houston and tried to identify the specific spot where the train stopped. I cannot find a crossing that matches what I remember. There are infrastructure crossings on that line. I know this from the maps. But the one I remember had a particular quality to it, a particular depth of dark, that I cannot match to any specific coordinates I have found. This might just mean I have the location wrong. I was 19, it was 3 a.m., I was disoriented from broken sleep. Or it might mean something else. I do not know. What I know is that the man at the crossing was wearing a gray hoodie. The fabric on the seat across from me was gray and the texture of hoodie material. The train stopped at that crossing and the fabric disappeared during the stop. These are 3 facts. I cannot explain the connection between them in any way that fully satisfies me. I cannot explain it as coincidence. I cannot explain it as a series of unrelated events. I just have the 3 facts and the absence of any mechanism connecting them. I have thought about the binder or folder or whatever it was that he held against his chest. The way he held it. Both arms wrapped around it. The way you hold something you have had for a long time and are accustomed to carrying. Something that belongs to you completely. I have thought about what would be in a binder that a person carries to a railroad crossing in the middle of southeast Texas at 3:12 in the morning to show to a window on a passing train. I have no satisfying answer to that either. I just know he was holding something and that he did not hold it up toward the window. He held it against his chest. Whatever was in it, he was not trying to show me. He already had what he came for. The pointing was enough. The pointing was the whole thing. I was 19 years old and taking a train alone for the first time, and someone in the dark already knew which window was mine. That is the sentence I come back to. It was my first time on that route. I had not taken that train before. And yet, I try not to finish that thought. It goes to a place I do not enjoy visiting. Thank you to everyone who sent in these disturbing true stories. If you recognize any of these accounts because something similar happened to you, or if you have your own version of this, a train that stopped somewhere it should not have, a compartment that felt wrong, a person who watched you from a backward-facing seat, a sound that came through a wall from somewhere that was supposed to be empty, I want to hear from you. Thank you to everyone who sent in these disturbing true stories. If you have experienced something on a train, in a sleeper compartment, at a night crossing, in a station after midnight, and you have never been able to explain it, send it to the email in the description. I read all of it. Every account. Every detail. These are the true horror stories that stay with me longest because they have the specific concrete details that real things have. The details that fiction does not know to include. And the next time you settle into your seat on a night train and the lights dim and the country goes dark outside the window, take a moment to check who is sitting near you. Check whether they were there when you boarded. Check whether they are facing the right direction. And if the train stops somewhere that is not a station, somewhere with no platform and no lights and flat dark land in every direction, keep your eyes on your own reflection in the glass. Because there are true paranormal stories and there are real scary stories, and then there are the accounts that I cannot put neatly into either category. The ones about night trains stopping in places they should not stop. And what is standing in the gravel beside the track. And whether it already knows which window is yours.